Ever find yourself like watching the news or scrolling online, see someone famous, and it hits you, do I even really know this person?
It's like this weird disconnect, right, between the public persona and the private individual.
Exactly. And how are we supposed to make sense of that, especially when things get complicated, you know? Like, how do you reconcile someone's achievements with their personal life when those two things collide?
Yeah, it's a question that comes up a lot these days, especially with social media. Everyone's life is under a microscope.
Totally. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, the career of footballer Chet Evans. This article we've got here really digs into it, all his talent on the field, but also this huge legal case that kind of overshadowed everything.
It's one of those stories that really makes you think about how we judge people, success, failure, all of it.
Okay, so before we get into all that, set the scene for us.
Yeah.
It's the early 2010s, football's in full swing.
Yeah.
Who is Chet Evans at this point in his career?
Imagine this. Young, hungry striker making a name for himself. Starts at Manchester City, talk about pressure. But it's with Sheffield United where he really explodes.
Wait, he was scoring like crazy back then, wasn't he? I'm having flashback to some crazy goals.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We're talking nearly 50 goals for Sheffield United. That's not just luck, that's talent. He even earns caps for the Wales national team, the whole package. At 23, he's living the dream. Fans adore him. Big clubs are interested. Bright future.
Sounds like he was on top of the world.
He was. Until 2012.
That's when everything changes, right?
One word. Accusation. Rape.
Mm-hmm.
And just like that, everything's different. This isn't some minor infraction. This is serious, legally and socially, especially for someone in the public eye.
Wow, yeah. The pressure that comes with that, for him, for the club, must be immense.
Sheffield United had to act fast, and they did. Contract. Gone. Didn't matter how many goals he'd scored. Public opinion had already shifted.
So, in what felt like a split second, he goes from rising star to facing this incredibly serious charge dropped by his club. It's kind of a reminder that what happens off the pitch can really derail even the most promising careers. Huh?
And honestly, that was just the beginning. This case wasn't just about Chet Evans. It became a much bigger conversation about us. But we'll get into all that in a bit.
Okay, so I've got this meteoric rise followed by, well, a very public fall from grace. Where do we even go from here?
This is where the case itself and all the controversy around it really takes center stage. Because remember, this is 2012, social media is blowing up, everyone's got an opinion, and it all gets tangled up. Justice, judgment, what people are saying online, it's a lot.
It's like the whole world turned into a courtroom.
Exactly. And this is where Chet Evans' story stops being just about him and starts to become something much bigger.
So, last we left off, this incredibly talented footballer is staring down a serious charge, public opinion's already turning. What happens next?
Well, the legal process plays out. In that first trial, Chet Evans is found guilty, gets a 5-year prison sentence.
5 years? That's not nothing. Even if you wanted to come back to football after that, it seems like that'd be tough.
Oh, absolutely. Those 5 years weren't just time served. They became, a turning point for him. Personally, professionally, the whole deal. And this is where things get really interesting because it's not just his story anymore, It becomes this flashpoint for bigger conversations.
You're saying the Chet Evans case, it became about something bigger than just him.
Right. Happens all the time with these high-profile cases. They turn into like lightning rods. Suddenly everyone's debating all these huge, complicated social issues.
And what was the context back then? Is this right around when the hashtag #MeToo movement was gaining traction?
You're a bit ahead of ourselves there. Hashtag #MeToo hadn't exploded yet the way it did a few years later. But you're right. There was this growing awareness, right, about sexual assault, how often what happens, how these cases were handled. It was in the air.
So Chet Evans's case,
Yeah.
it's like it became symbolic of that whole conversation in a way.
Exactly. And it divided people, right? On one side, you had people saying, look, this is a victory. Even famous athletes aren't above the law. But on the other side,
There were people who felt like he was being made an example of.
yeah, exactly. They felt like maybe he was a scapegoat, caught up in the media frenzy, that he didn't get a fair shake. And remember, public opinion was already against him, even before the trial started.
Yeah, it's like everyone had already made up their minds. Guilty or not, the damage was done.
And it goes deeper than that too, right? The Evans case made people confront some really uncomfortable stuff. The power dynamics in sports, especially between male athletes and female fans. How we as a society think about consent, responsibility. It wasn't just about one night, it was about the whole culture.
So, wow. It wasn't even about whether he was guilty in a legal sense anymore. It was about the message it sent. Heavy stuff.
It was a lot to unpack then, and honestly, it still is. Because then the question became, okay, what happens next? Someone serves their time, are they allowed to move on, rebuild their lives, or will they always be defined by this one thing?
And for Chet Evans, that question was about to become very, very real. Because through it all, he always insisted he was innocent. And then things took another turn.
Retrial.
So much to unpack here. We've got this case, right, that's become about way more than just one guy, all these big questions swirling around. And then on top of it all, a retrial. That's not exactly common, is it?
It's definitely not the usual route, no. Things get kind of technical here, legally speaking, but basically new evidence came to light. And based on that, Evans gets a retrial in 2016. Important to remember, this doesn't automatically mean the first trial was wrong or anything, just that this new evidence, it was enough to take a second look.
Okay, so what happened? Did this new evidence actually change things?
It did. The retrial, it ends with Chet Evans being found not guilty. He's free to go. But, and this is where it gets even more complicated, not guilty doesn't equal innocent. You know what I mean?
Hold up. Gotta admit, I'm a little lost. What's the difference, legally speaking?
Okay, so think of it like this. Not guilty, in the eyes of the law, just means they couldn't prove it. Like the prosecution, they didn't have enough to convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, just means they couldn't prove it to the level they needed to.
Ah, okay, yeah. Big difference. So Evans is acquitted, but that doesn't erase everything, does it? There's still that shadow, you know?
Exactly. Public opinion, it's not a court of law. People had already made up their minds, and those are tough to change. Some folks, they heard not guilty, and that was it. Justice served, time to move on. But for a lot of others, it wasn't so simple. The accusations, they stuck.
So where does that leave him? He wants to play ball again, but our team's going to take that risk. With all the baggage,
Yeah.
the public opinion.
That's the million-dollar question, right? And there's no easy answer, no rule book for this kind of situation. Some clubs, they were hesitant, understandably right, worried about the fans, the reputation of the club. But others, they saw it differently. A talented player, legally allowed to work, end of story.
And what about Evans himself? What did he do?
He was determined, wanted to get back to the game, rebuild his career. And he did play for a few different clubs, you know, Chesterfield, even back to Sheffield United for a bit, Fleetwood Town. He was out there, on the pitch, but...
There's a but coming, isn't there?
Well, he never quite hit that same stride again. You know, the goal-scoring machine, the international appearances, it wasn't the same. Now, was that all because of what happened? Hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
Maybe being away from the game that long, it took its toll. Or maybe it was the emotional weight of it all, you know? Hard to tell.
It really makes you think, can you ever really separate the person from the player? Especially in this day and age, social media and all that.
Yeah.
Every little thing gets magnified, scrutinized.
It's complicated, that's for sure. And Chet Evans, his story, it's like it puts all that complexity on display. It's not just about football. It's about how we as a society deal with these really gray areas. Justice, second chances, what it means to be redeemed in the public eye. It's a lot.
It really is. Leaves you with a lot to think about, that's for sure. Like next time we see an athlete in the news, in the headlines, are we getting the full picture? And how much weight should we give to the past, even when someone's been cleared legally? Lots to ponder.
No easy answers, but that's why we're having this conversation, right? It's a start.